Back in July of '75, I'd only been a park ranger for a few months at the Yosemite backcountry. Honestly, I still thought of myself more as a glorified camper than an actual ranger. Getting to explore the park and call it work was a dream gig after all. Still, the job was no less important because I was new, which is exactly what I was explaining to a new group of backpackers who had come to my post to get their permits squared away. "Don't worry, we're careful with fires," the ringleader, a portly old fellow with a bushy mustache, reassured me. They all looked the experienced type, so I tried to keep the spiel short and sweet. "I know you are. Just remember to double-check them before you leave. Fire's no joke." I gave them a friendly reminder. Of course," the bushy mustache guy nodded, looking mildly offended at my implication. I wrapped up with the routine warnings about trash and bear canisters, trying to lighten the mood with a joke about raccoons being even wilder than bears sometimes. They chuckled politely, a couple of the women a little more genuinely than the fellas, then headed off for their trailhead. The group was probably headed to May Lake or somewhere deeper in. Since all the paperwork was in order, I turned back to other duties, mostly tidying up around my station and updating the logbook. The job was full of these quiet moments. There was always work to do, but thankfully nothing too pressing. It was one of the nicer parts of the job, the downtime. The rest of the day passed without incident. A few stragglers stopped to ask directions. 2 separate couples asked about wildlife sightings. And of course, someone wanted to complain about the park's mosquito population. That afternoon, I finished up around sunset and headed back to the tiny ranger's cabin I called home. It was tucked away in a small copse of trees, offering some decent privacy in the otherwise bustling heart of the park. By the time I arrived, night had fallen, casting the whole forest in inky black. The ranger's cabin was just a faint silhouette in the darkness. I was just fishing out my flashlight when a sound snagged my attention. It came from the woods behind the cabin. The rhythmic crack of a branch, followed by a low rustling. I held my breath. It was normal enough to hear small animals out here, squirrels or maybe even a deer. Maybe I'd spooked something bigger on my walk back. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding a bit thin even to my own ears. Nothing, just silence. I shrugged it off, attributing it to my newbie nerves, and went inside. After cooking up a simple dinner, I sat out on the porch for a while. The sky was a canvas of stars, the summer air heavy with the scent of pine. The next morning, I woke up early, energized to do a patrol of the back trails. I'd been meaning to do the loop out west in 2 alumni meadows for a while. I grabbed a granola bar, packed a lunch, and radioed headquarters about my route. Out there, it was mandatory to check in, so they knew where to find you if something went wrong. The first few miles of the trail were uneventful, thankfully. It was a gorgeous day, perfect for hiking. The route was fairly popular, so I crossed paths with a few groups, always stopping for a quick chat and a reminder about the usual fire hazards. It wasn't unusual to encounter the same people at various points along the loop. The park was vast, but so were some hikers' itineraries. I found a nice little rock to sit and enjoy my lunch. It was starting to get pretty hot out, and a touch of shade was a welcome respite. While I was unwrapping my sandwich, I thought I heard a rustling over by the creek, but when I looked, nothing. Just the wind through the trees, probably. Nervy again, damn it. I needed to shake off this rookie anxiety. I ate in peace, tossing the last bits of my crust to a squirrel who was eyeing me with bold curiosity. Getting back on the trail, it was smooth sailing for a good hour, meandering through a thick patch of pines. And then the trail just disappeared. Confused, I backtracked a few paces, looking for signs I might have missed a fork or a detour. Finding nothing, I cursed my inattentiveness. It wasn't the first time this had happened out on patrol. Hikers often made their own makeshift trails that went nowhere. But this one had been so well trodden. Shrugging, I backtracked again. planning to find another path that connected further down the mountain, even if it meant a slightly longer loop. I was walking for a good 20 minutes before I realized something was truly wrong. The forest was growing denser, the trees unfamiliar as they closed in around me. The sun, already lower on the horizon, was barely filtering through the canopy. Yet, there was no marked trail. No indication I was heading in the right direction. I was completely lost. Panic started to rise in my chest, that prickly, cold, sweat kind of panic I'd only felt a few times in my life. Losing your bearings in the wilderness was serious business, and even with my radio, if the rangers started a search party, these woods were thick enough to make it a long haul. I paused, trying to think logically, which involved trying to calm myself down. I fished out my compass, then cursed aloud as it spun wildly, the magnetic field thrown off by something nearby. No help there. The experienced hiker in me knew you shouldn't wander aimlessly when lost. Better to pick a spot and stay put, conserve your energy and hope to be found. But something about this felt off. The whole situation was unsettling. This sudden, impossible detour on a clear enough trail. Against my better judgment, I decided to push on, keeping the sun to my right as I continued west. My pace was brisk now, a mix of desperation and the sinking certainty that something wasn't adding up. Then I saw it. A movement just at the edge of my vision. I whipped my head around, heart racing. There was nothing to see, yet this sense that I was being watched was overwhelming. Then I caught it again. A dark shape, moving fast, darting from tree to tree. But whenever I turned to get a good look at it, it was gone. It was too big to be any animal I knew of, in this unnatural speed. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound brave, but my voice came out a croak. I strained my eyes, searching the shadows between the trunks. Silence. Only the distant creak of branches and my own ragged breaths. The fear was starting to gnaw away at my focus, turning my movements jerky. Every rustle of leaves had me on edge. It was like a game of hide and seek, only I didn't know the rules or what it even was. I pushed on doggedly, trying to outrun my imagination, trying to get back to something familiar. The sun was sinking fast, casting long, strange shadows. My fear intensified with every step. And still, whatever was stalking me stayed in the periphery, unseen yet unnervingly present. A tree directly ahead of me shuddered violently, its leaves cascaded down like rain. For a split second I saw it. A colossal shape, hunched low against the trunk, the bark a mottled texture like old, stretched skin. It turned its head and I couldn't make out a face, but I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that it was looking straight at me. My mind went blank with terror. No scream, no movement. Time seemed to freeze as I stared at this thing that could not exist. It was massive, easily twice as tall as I was, its silhouette bulky and contorted. Its limbs were long, too long, ending in twiggy appendages that almost seemed like fingers, but so much longer and thicker. It moved with a chilling fluidity, its joints shifting and bending in ways that made my stomach churn. And then, it launched itself towards me, moving with a speed that defied belief. I barely had time to register its horrifying lunge before I turned and ran. Every instinct in my body screamed to get as far away from this creature as possible. Branches whipped past me, tearing at my skin, and my feet barely seemed to touch the forest floor. Still, I could hear it gaining, its heavy footfalls and rustling breaths growing closer. I was nearing the edge of a clearing, a break in the tree line that opened into a rocky cliff. My heart lurched with hope, even as my legs throbbed in protest. Just a little farther. My lungs felt like they were on fire, each ragged breath burning my throat. That damn clearing was so close now, yet it seemed to stretch out endlessly, like a mirage in a desert. I tripped over a root, falling hard, scraping up my palms. The heavy thud of its steps was right behind me. Rolling over, I stared up at the trees. The monster about to crash through the foliage, and silence. Nothing but the echo of my own harsh breaths. I scrambled to my feet, half expecting it to drop from the canopy at any second, to lunge out from behind a tree trunk, but still, nothing. I turned this way and that, trying to spot it amidst the shadows, the silence somehow more terrifying than its previous pursuit. Unable to think clearly, I stumbled towards the clearing, drawn to the open sky and the relative promise of safety it offered. My body was shaking, adrenaline threatening to turn into full-blown panic. Just as I was about to burst out of the trees, something seized my ankle in an unbreakable grip. I yelped in terror, falling back to the earth, its hand wrapped around my leg, long gnarled fingers digging into my skin with a strength that made me scream in pain. I kicked out with my other leg, fighting frantically. It barely reacted. I was being dragged backward, back toward those monstrous eyes lurking in the darkness. Desperation made me thrash wildly, clawing at the iron grip around my ankle. It didn't move an inch, but I caught a glimpse of my attacker's arm, pale beneath the thick black fur. It moved as it dragged me back into the trees, sinuous and unnatural. Its skin was leathery, almost bark-like, mottled with lichen green patches. Scrabbling for purchase, my hand closed around a fallen branch. Without thinking, I swung it with all my remaining force at the creature's wrist. To my absolute surprise, I heard a crack and a hiss, and the grip immediately loosened. I kicked out again, this time managing to break free. My attacker howled in what was either pain or rage, a sound that made my blood run cold. I didn't look back as I bolted toward the clearing. Bursting into the open, the setting sun blazed in my eyes. I staggered toward the cliffside, the world tilting and spinning as exhaustion finally took its toll. When my vision cleared, I was standing at the precipice, the sharp drop-off and jagged rock stretching out below. I slumped down, panting heavily, too spent to even process the situation. It seemed I had reached a stalemate. Either it was too afraid of the fall or too injured to approach. But as the light faded, I knew I was trapped. I stayed huddled in a little ball, unable to force myself to do more than watch the sky shift through hues of dusk and finally disappear into deep nightfall. It didn't attack, but I could sense it still out there, hidden in the darkness, a silent, menacing presence. I couldn't sleep, my mind replaying the day's terrifying ordeal. Hours later, when dawn broke, I was delirious with exhaustion and fear. I looked at the cliff edge and a desperate thought occurred to me. I might not survive a direct attack, but maybe with a head start I could risk the drop and scramble down before the creature caught up. I crept cautiously towards the edge, no sign of it, praying that the jagged rocks and fall wouldn't end me before the creature could. Time lost all meaning. I only remember scrambling, rolling, slipping downwards, a blur of cuts, bruises, and overwhelming terror. At some point I lost consciousness, waking up in a pile of leaves at the base of the cliff. I was battered, broken, and bloodied, but alive. The sun was higher now, meaning precious time had been lost. I knew I needed to move. Somehow I pulled myself upright, ignoring the protests of my body. Every step was agony, and twice I nearly fainted, but I kept going. The adrenaline of survival wouldn't let me stop. Eventually, sheer willpower led me to a familiar hiking trail, where I collapsed completely. I woke up much later, not in the forest but in a hospital bed. Rangers found me, apparently babbling incoherently. My injuries were extensive, but I recovered, physically at least. The Park Service, of course, had questions. At first I couldn't speak about what happened. Later, when I tried, they chalked it up to shock and a nasty fall. But I know what I saw, and more importantly, I know it's still out there. The creature became a dark legend of the park, a campfire story told to scare new rangers and thrill adventurous hikers. The ones who believe my tale whisper its name, Branchbreaker. It haunts my nightmares, a reminder that the wilderness holds horrors stranger than we can imagine. Summer I was 24, I snagged a gig as a ranger in Red Lodge State Park out in Minnesota. A small-timer from New York, I figured the quiet woods would be a nice change of pace. Plus, my buddy Vance had done the same thing a few years back, and he said the scenery wasn't half bad. He also said the job was a whole lot of nothing, which sounded even better coming from him. I was assigned the South Stretch, a good 30 miles of trails, picnic areas, the whole deal. I'm not gonna lie, during my first few weeks Vance had it spot on. I spent most of my days driving around tidying up campsites and waving at the occasional hiker. It was so peaceful, almost dull. Maybe that's why when things went sideways, it took me by complete surprise. It started with some missing person reports. Nothing unusual, folks wander off all the time. Still, protocol is protocol, so I made my rounds, chatting up campers about any strangers they might have seen. That's how I met Eleanor, a spry old gal with an Airstream and a suspicious demeanor. We got to talking, and she mentioned hearing strange noises at night. Not an animal. I know them calls, she'd said, squinting up those trails. Something bigger. Honestly, I chalked it up to her imagination, but I made a note to be more watchful around those parts of the park. A few days later, the radio crackles to life. It's HQ. Another hiker's vanished. They want me to do a sweep, focus on the south end where Eleanor had mentioned the sounds. Suddenly, that dullness doesn't feel so comforting anymore. I roll up to the designated starting point, radio at my hip, and set out on foot. The sun's starting to dip, making the woods look all shadowy and unsettling. I keep expecting to find a lost kid or a grumpy retiree, but all the trails turn up empty. Eleanor's noises play in my head, making every rustle of leaves sound monstrous. Man, Vance never mentioned being this easy to spook. The further in I get, the colder it feels, and not just cause the lights fading. It's like the air itself sits heavier here. Then I see it, a flash of movement deeper in the trees. "Hello, anyone there?" I call out. No one answers. My heart drums a rhythm on my ribs. I don't like the looks of this. I unclip the radio. HQ, this is Ranger Callahan. Possible sign of the missing hiker. Before I can finish my report, the thing steps out into the dusky light. Lord, I wish I could unsee it. It's tall, at least 7 feet, with wiry limbs that look too long. All twisted. Its head, that's the worst. Bulbous. Skin pulled tight like something rotting neath. No eyes. Only slits for a nose and a gash of a mouth that hangs wide open. It lets out a screech that pierces my ears, a sound I can't even describe. Fear shoots white-hot through my veins. Whatever this is, it ain't natural. I fumble for my sidearm, fingers trembling as I line up a shot. HQ, shots fired at... The creature lunges and it's fast, inhumanly fast. The gun flies out of my hand as I hit the ground, rolling to avoid a swipe of its impossibly long claws. My heart hammers like it's about to leap out of my chest. I scramble back, trying to put space between us, the forest blurring around me. I need to radio for help, but where's the damn thing? I whip my head around, searching the trees frantically. It could be anywhere, and there. Slinking across the branches like a warped spider. It screeches again, a sound that cuts right through me and leaps. Time slows. My mouth opens to scream, but all that comes out is a choked gasp as the weight of the creature crashes into my chest. My arm slams into a tree trunk hard enough to make my teeth rattle. It's a half-blind stumble from there, the adrenaline masking the flare of pain in my shoulder. I can hear that awful screech echoing behind me, getting closer. Branches whip at my face as I run, tearing at my clothes, my skin. Doesn't matter. Pain's temporary. Getting eaten ain't. Lungs screaming, I burst out into a clearing and skid to a halt. There's an old fire tower in the center. Rusty and skeletal, but it's high. If I can climb it, maybe I can get a signal on the radio, call for backup. It's my only shot. I sprint towards it, the metal ladder rungs cold beneath my battered hands. Scrambling up feels slow. clumsy with terror clawing in my throat. "Don't look down, don't look down," I chanted in my head. But I do. The creatures below, circling the base of the tower, those spindly limbs twitching as it regards me with that empty-eyed stare. Nearly at the top, I risk another glance. Through the trees, I can see my patrol truck. Just a little speck. The radio, if I could just get to it. I'm almost there, my fingers desperately grasping the last rung when the tower gives a sickening lurch. One of the rusted support beams groans, then snaps with a horrible metallic shriek. The whole thing tilts, slow at first, and then with terrifying speed. My scream gets cut short as the ground rushes up toward me. Pain explodes in my leg and blackness swallows me whole. I wake up in the hospital groggy and confused. A nurse tells me some hikers stumbled across me, unconscious but lucky to be alive. Broken leg, mild concussion, a hell of a story, she says. But when I try to explain what happened, the words stick in my throat. It sounds too wild, even to me. The other park rangers give me sympathetic looks, say I must have been in shock. Maybe they're right. That part's sadly unsurprising. But what I saw out there, I've worked forests my whole life, seen all manner of critters. That thing wasn't any bear or bobcat I've ever heard of. Eleanor, bless her nosy soul, comes to visit, brings me a pie and a whole lot of I-told-you-so energy. Turns out she had a run-in with the creature too, right around the time she'd reported those noises. It snatched one of her chickens and vanished back into the trees. We never saw it again. The reports of missing folks stopped too. Whatever it was, seems it moved on or found its fill. The park never officially reopened that trail. Unsafe conditions, the signs say. Fine by me. Vance called when he heard what happened, joked about me finally getting some excitement. I didn't find it so funny. They offered my old job back, of course. Said they needed experienced people after the whole incident. I turned it down, told them I'd taken a shine to the quiet indoors. They looked at me like I was nuts considering. Sometimes late at night, I still think I hear that screech, high and wrong, like a nail dragged across glass. The doctors blamed it on tinnitus, some nerve damage from the fall. Maybe they're right. But I started calling it the rakeback because of the way it looked all twisted and hunched. It seems as good a name as any for a monster you can't prove exists. I've worked on the Yellowstone backcountry trails for years, long enough to know all those whispered stories about rangers vanishing or just old wives' tales. You get lost, sure. An elk gets a little too close, you twist an ankle. Yeah, I get it. But the woods don't swallow folks whole, not out here. Today, though, as I patrol a section of the northern range, I'm starting to wonder if I underestimated this place. Something about this early summer afternoon feels off, like I'm being watched. Makes sense to a degree. This is grizzly territory, and they're fiercely protective of their cubs around this time of year. Still, this is different. It's more of a prickly feeling under my skin, the kind you get when someone's eyes are fixed on your back. I try to shrug it off, gotta focus on the task at hand. This overgrown path hasn't seen maintenance in ages, and there's a trip report claiming a hazardously tilted bridge near the 2-mile mark. I'm nearing that spot now, pushing my way through thick brush. Suddenly, I hear it. A low growl, so deep it practically thrums my chest. My eyes scan for movement, but whatever made the sound stays hidden. Another growl, louder this time, closer. No denying it. I'm being stalked. I draw my radio. Ranger Elroy requesting backup. Possible predator encounter near. Static cuts me off. Damn it, the signal's always spotty out here. I try again, but it's no use. I'm alone. Then it hits me. What if this thing, whatever it is messing with my radio signal on purpose? The thought's ridiculous, except something ripped a whole chunk out of a communications tower further down the range last year. Nobody ever figured out what could have done that. Suddenly, the dense foliage in front of me practically explodes, and I recoil in horror. It's massive, easily 8 feet tall, bipedal, but loping on all fours like an overgrown ape. Its body is thick with shaggy hair, the color of dried blood, and its arms drag on the ground, ending in vicious-looking claws. The head, gods, the head is the worst part. It's misshapen. The snout elongated into something almost wolfish. Pale, bulbous eyes stare out from under a heavy brow, a predatory hunger shining in their depths. I freeze. My training tells me to stand my ground, raise my arms, make noise. But this creature doesn't feel like any bear I've ever known. There's an unnatural intelligence in its gaze, something calculating. My gun rests holstered on my hip, but before I can even think to reach for it, the thing lurches towards me. Now I'm running, scrambling through the trees, ignoring the branches tearing at my arms. The beast thrashes behind me, surprisingly quick for its bulk. It bellows, an unearthly sound that chills my blood. I stumble, hitting the ground hard. My world tilts painfully as I realize my ankle is twisted, maybe even broken. I scramble up, but I'm too slow. It's on me in a flash, its foul breath washing over me, its rank claws digging into my shoulder, then a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. 2 shapes, pale-faced and lithe, explode from the undergrowth, shrieking wildly. The creature seems startled for a moment. My attackers, whatever they are, waste no time in capitalizing. They move in a blur, flanking the beast and striking it with crude stone weapons. It roars, its focus shifting from me as it tries to fight them off. My heart thunders in my chest. I have a chance. I struggle to my feet, limping away as fast as I can. The battle rages behind me, a cacophony of enraged bellows and those unsettling high-pitched cries. I dare a glance over my shoulder. One of my rescuers lies splayed on the ground, motionless. The other one continues to fight, desperately harrying the creature, driving it deeper into the trees. I keep moving, forcing myself forward despite the pain. I have to get out of here, have to radio for help. Whatever those things were, they bought me enough time. But for how long? The thought of that hulking monstrosity tearing through the forest still on my scent sends a fresh surge of terror through me. I don't know if I'll make it. My lungs burn, every breath a ragged gasp as I stumble through the trees. The relentless crashing behind me tells me my pursuer hasn't given up the chase yet. I can't outpace it. That much is clear, but maybe, just maybe, I can outsmart it. I spot a narrow ravine up ahead. Risky, but it could be my only chance. I veer towards it, my broken ankle sending sharp stabs of pain up my leg, and hurl myself down the steep incline. Mud and loose rocks slide beneath me, but I don't dare slow down. At the bottom, creek cuts through the ravine, surprisingly deep and swift given the time of year. Desperate, I plunge in. The icy water shocks my system, momentarily numbing the pain. I force myself to swim against the current, the creature's roars echoing above me. Is it still on the bank, confused, or did it follow me down? I reach a bend in the ravine, offering a sliver of concealment. I drag myself onto a narrow outcropping, barely large enough to hold my weight, and try to catch my breath. My pursuer bursts into view, scrambling along the top of the ravine. Its beady eyes search frantically, finally locking on me. It lopes back and forth along the bank, growling in frustration. Below me the current rages. My only escape route is also a potential death trap, but staying means becoming its next meal. A wild gamble, but my best, maybe even only chance. With a gasp, I push myself off the rock, surrendering to the current. The shock of icy water slams into me, the force of it threatening to rip me under. I fight to keep my head above the surface, gasping, choking, the world reduced to the roar of the water and the dull pounding of my heart. Then, abruptly, I'm flung into a shallow pool where the water's briefly calm. I cough and scramble upright, only to lose my footing again. The current drags me mercilessly onwards. Up ahead the sound changes, a deafening rumble that makes the hairs on my neck stand on end. A waterfall. My stomach twists in terror. I'm going over. There's nothing I can do to stop it. The roar intensifies as I plunge into icy darkness, my body tumbling and thrashing against unseen rocks. And then, nothing. I'm suddenly floating, weightless. I break the surface, sputtering, my body aching with battered bruises. Ahead, the creek widens into a calm river. Somehow, I made it. I'm alive. Dragging myself onto the bank, I collapse, trembling uncontrollably. Above me, the forest is eerily quiet. The creature seems to be gone. Hours pass in a blur. My body finally gives in to exhaustion, and I sink into a troubled sleep. I'm awakened by the sound of voices. A search and rescue team found me, drawn by the faint signal my radio eventually managed to squeak through. In the days that followed, I told them everything. The creature, the fight in the woods, my desperate escape, the missing ranger they'd been sent to find. The rescue team was concerned, understandably, but there was little they could do. No body, no evidence of the creature, nothing but the shredded remains of my backpack. My story was met with skepticism, post-traumatic stress, maybe hallucinations induced by a head injury. The explanations all sounded reasonable, even to me. And yet, I remember the pale figure slumped on the forest floor, its inhuman, high-pitched scream as the creature closed in. That one detail haunts me, makes me wonder. Now, back at home trying to recover, I find myself drawn to those old stories of vanished rangers. They talk about a hulking, monstrous figure in the woods, about strange tracks no known animal could make, about livestock found gruesomely mutilated. And these stories, scattered across the backwoods of the Yellowstone, have one thing in common. They always name the beast. Scragmaw, Strix, Wendigo. Different words, different tribes, yet they seem to be describing the same impossible creature, the one that nearly took my life. I decide to give it a name, too. A word that fits the unsettling sound of its guttural growls, the way its heavy footfalls shook the earth. From now on, in my mind, it will always be the Grand. Maybe it's just a coping mechanism, but it feels important to acknowledge the truth. However horrific and hard to believe, the woods hold things we don't understand, and maybe we're meant not to understand them at all. The biting wind whipped across my face as I stepped out of my car, the cold immediately seeping through my layers despite my careful preparation. It was a crisp winter morning at Indiana Dunes State Park, and the world around me was blanketed in a thick layer of pristine white snow. The parking lot was deserted, my car the only vehicle in sight. The silence was almost eerie, broken only by the occasional creak of a tree branch heavy with snow. I had come here seeking solitude, a chance to clear my mind and escape the chaos of everyday life. Little did I know that this seemingly peaceful winter wonderland would soon become the backdrop for one of the most harrowing experiences of my life. As I locked my car and pocketed the keys, I took a moment to survey my surroundings. The familiar landscape of the park had been transformed into an alien terrain of white dunes and snow-laden trees. The lake, which I knew lay beyond the dunes, was nowhere in sight, obscured by the thick curtain of gently falling snow. I set off down what I assumed was the main trail, my boots crunching satisfyingly in the fresh powder. The world around me was muffled, every sound dampened by the snow. It felt as though I had stepped into another dimension, one where time stood still, and the troubles of the world couldn't reach me. As I walked, my mind wandered to the events that had led me here. The stress of my job, the recent breakup with my long-term partner, the feeling of being lost in my own life. It had all become too much. This solo trip to Indiana Dunes was meant to be a reset, a chance to reconnect with myself and figure out my next steps. Lost in thought, I barely noticed as the terrain began to change. The gentle slopes of the dunes gave way to a vast, flat expanse. I assumed I had reached the beach, though the thick snow made it impossible to discern any features of the landscape. I pressed on, marveling at the untouched expanse before me. It wasn't until much later that I would realize the gravity of my mistake. In that moment, however, I was blissfully unaware of the danger lurking beneath my feet. I was walking on thin ice, quite literally, and my life was about to change forever. As I trudged through the snow, the wind picked up, driving icy particles into my face. I pulled my scarf tighter, grateful for the warmth it provided. The vast whiteness stretched out before me, unbroken and beautiful. I felt a sense of peace wash over me, the troubles that had driven me here momentarily forgotten. I must have walked for at least 20 minutes when I decided to take a break. I found a spot that seemed slightly elevated, perhaps a sand dune beneath the snow, and sat down. As I caught my breath, I reached for my water bottle, only to find it had frozen in the extreme cold. I chuckled to myself, amused by my lack of foresight. It was then that I heard it, a faint cracking sound beneath me. At first, I dismissed it as the settling of snow, but as I shifted my weight, the sound intensified. A chill ran down my spine, and this time it wasn't from the cold. Slowly, carefully, I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a snow-covered beach. I was standing on the frozen lake. Panic threatened to overwhelm me as the gravity of my situation became clear. I had no idea how far out onto the lake I had wandered, or how thick the ice beneath my feet was. Every step could be my last. I turned back the way I had come, trying to retrace my steps, but the falling snow had already obscured my tracks. The shore was nowhere in sight, hidden behind a curtain of white. I felt utterly alone and terrifyingly vulnerable. With no other choice, I began to walk, each step cautious and measured. The cracking sounds continued, sometimes loud enough to make me freeze in place, my heart in my throat. Time seemed to stretch, minutes feeling like hours as I inched my way across the treacherous ice. As I walked, my mind raced. How could I have been so careless? I thought of my family, my friends. Would they ever know what happened to me if the worst came to pass? The weight of my mortality pressed down on me, heavier than the thickest winter coat. I don't know how long I had been walking when I saw it. A dark shape in the distance, barely visible through the swirling snow. At first, I thought it might be a hallucination, a trick of my fear-addled mind. But as I drew closer, the shape solidified into a sign. Relief flooded through me as I approached the sign, but it was short-lived. The words on the sign sent a fresh wave of terror through me. Danger! Thin ice ahead! Do not proceed! I had made it back to the shore, but the realization of how close I had come to disaster hit me hard. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the snow-covered ground, my body shaking with a mixture of relief and residual fear. As I sat there, catching my breath and letting the reality of my narrow escape sink in, I became aware of just how quiet and empty the park was. If something had happened to me out on that ice, who knows how long it would have been before anyone found me. Slowly, I got to my feet and made my way back to the parking lot. My car stood alone, a solitary sentinel in the winter landscape. As I drove away from Indiana Dunes State Park, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel, I knew that this experience had changed me profoundly. In the days and weeks that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about that day on the ice. The fragility of life, the importance of awareness, the power of nature. All of these thoughts swirled in my mind like the snow that had nearly been my undoing. In the months following my near-death experience at Indiana Dunes, I found myself struggling with unexpected consequences. Nightmares plagued my sleep, vivid recreations of that day on the ice. Only in these dreams, I wasn't so lucky. I'd wake up gasping, my sheets drenched in sweat, the phantom sensation of icy water closing over my head, lingering even in the warm safety of my bedroom. My family and friends noticed the change in me. I became withdrawn, jumpy at unexpected sounds, and reluctant to venture out in winter weather. My sister Sarah finally confronted me about it over coffee one chilly autumn morning. "You're not yourself," she said, her brow furrowed with concern. "Have you considered talking to someone about what happened?" I bristled at first, defensive. "I'm fine," I insisted. "It was just a close call, that's all." But Sarah's words stuck with me, and eventually I found myself sitting in a therapist's office, recounting my experience to Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a specialist in trauma and PTSD. As I worked with Dr. Rodriguez, I began to realize that my experience at Indiana Dunes had dredged up long-buried fears and insecurities. We delved into my childhood, exploring the roots of my need for solitude and my tendency to push myself to dangerous limits. I remembered a day from my youth, when I was just 10 years old. My father, an avid outdoorsman, had taken me ice fishing on a small lake near our home. "Always respect the ice," he had told me, demonstrating how to test its thickness with an auger. "Nature doesn't care if you're not ready for her challenges." That day, we had heard a loud crack echo across the lake. My father's face had gone pale, and he'd rushed us off the ice, pulling me along behind him. We'd made it to shore safely, but the memory of that sound, so similar to what I'd heard at Indiana Dunes, had been buried in my subconscious for years. Through our sessions, Dr. Rodriguez helped me understand how this childhood experience had shaped my adult behaviors, including my solo trip to the dunes in winter. I was subconsciously trying to prove something to myself, to conquer a fear I didn't even know I had. As winter approached again, I felt a familiar dread building inside me. But this time, instead of retreating, I decided to face my fears head-on. I enrolled in a winter survival course, learning proper techniques for navigating icy conditions and recognizing potential dangers. During the course, I met Jack, a gruff but kind-hearted retired park ranger. When I shared my story with him, his eyes lit up with recognition. "I remember that day," he said, shaking his head. "I was off duty, but I drove by the park on my way home. Saw a lone car in the lot and had a bad feeling about it. I called it in, and they sent a patrol out to check. I was stunned." "That was you?" I had no idea anyone even knew I was there. Jack nodded solemnly. "In this line of work, you develop a sixth sense for trouble. I'm glad you made it out okay." Our conversation sparked an idea. With Jack's encouragement, I began volunteering at Indiana Dunes, helping to educate visitors about winter safety and the hidden dangers of the park. A year to the day after my ill-fated walk on the frozen lake, I stood at the edge of Indiana Dunes State Park, leading a group of hikers on a winter safety tour. The snow crunched beneath our boots as we made our way along the shore, the frozen expanse of Lake Michigan stretching out before us. As we reached the spot where I had unknowingly ventured onto the ice a year ago, I paused, taking in the scene. The park had installed new, larger warning signs, partly due to my advocacy efforts over the past year. "This spot right here," I told the group, my voice carrying on the crisp winter air, "is where I learned one of the most important lessons of my life." I shared my story with them, watching as their eyes widened in understanding. As I spoke, I felt a sense of closure washing over me. The fear and trauma that had haunted me for so long began to loosen their grip. One of the hikers, a young woman named Maya, approached me after the tour. "Your story really moved me," she said. "I've always loved winter sports, but I never really thought about the dangers. Thank you for opening my eyes." Her words warmed me more than any winter gear could. I realized that by sharing my experience, I was not only healing myself, but potentially saving others from making the same mistakes I had. Encouraged by the response to my tours and safety talks, I decided to write a book about my experience and the broader issue of winter safety in natural parks. The process of writing was therapeutic, allowing me to explore my thoughts and feelings in depth. I interviewed park rangers, survival experts, and other individuals who had close calls in winter conditions. Their stories, woven together with my own, created a tapestry of caution and respect for nature's power. As I wrote, I also delved into the science behind ice formation on large bodies of water, the psychology of risk-taking in nature, and the history of winter recreation in national and state parks. The project consumed me, giving me a new purpose and direction. During my research for the book, I came across a news article about a family who had lost their son to a similar accident on a frozen lake in Minnesota. Moved by their story, I reached out to them, unsure of how they would respond. To my surprise, the Andersons, Tom, Lisa, and their daughter Emma, were eager to talk. We met over video call, and as I shared my story and listened to theirs, I felt a profound connection forming. After we lost Kyle, Lisa said, her eyes glistening with tears, we felt so alone in our grief. Hearing your story, knowing that someone understands the dangers and is working to prevent similar tragedies, it gives his death some meaning. The Andersons agreed to contribute to my book, sharing Kyle's story as a poignant reminder of what's at stake. Our collaboration led to a friendship that would prove invaluable in the years to come. As my book neared completion, I realized that I wanted to do more than just write about the issue. With the help of the Andersons, Jack, and other allies I'd made along the way, I launched a national campaign for improved winter safety measures in parks across the country. We lobbied for better signage, increased funding for winter patrols, and enhanced education programs for park visitors. Our efforts caught the attention of several state legislators, and soon we found ourselves testifying before committee hearings, sharing our stories, and pushing for change. The campaign was exhausting but exhilarating. For every setback, there was a small victory. Slowly but surely, we began to see changes implemented in parks around the nation. 5 years after my near-fatal walk on the ice, I returned to Indiana Dunes State Park for the grand opening of the new Winter Safety Center. The small building, located near the spot where I had first ventured onto the frozen lake, was a testament to years of hard work and advocacy. As I cut the ribbon, surrounded by park officials, local politicians, and many of the people who had been part of my journey, I felt a sense of completion. The terrified, naive person who had walked out onto that ice half a decade ago was gone, replaced by someone wiser, more cautious, but also more connected to the world around them. Looking back on that winter day at Indiana Dunes, I'm struck by how a single misstep, literal and figurative, can change the course of a life. My walk on thin ice could have ended in tragedy, but instead, it became the catalyst for growth, change, and a newfound purpose. I've learned that life often places us on thin ice, testing our resilience and adaptability. The key is not to avoid these challenges altogether, but to approach them with respect, preparation, and a willingness to learn from our mistakes and the wisdom of others. My journey from a solitary walker in a snowy park to an advocate for winter safety has taught me the power of community, the importance of facing our fears, and the profound impact that sharing our stories can have on others. As I stand here today, watching visitors explore the new Winter Safety Center, I'm reminded of the countless unseen dangers that surround us every day. But I'm also filled with hope, knowing that through education, awareness, and mutual support, we can navigate even the most treacherous paths. The frozen lake that nearly claimed my life has become a symbol of transformation and resilience. It's a reminder that sometimes our greatest challenges can lead us to our true calling, if only we have the courage to step carefully, listen to the warnings around us, and reach out to others along the way. And so, my story continues, no longer a solitary journey on thin ice, but a shared expedition towards greater understanding and respect for the delicate balance between human adventure and nature's awesome power. Last Sunday, I decided to go on a camping trip with my friends to the dense cedar forest, located 2 hours away from our city. I was very excited about this adventure, as it was an opportunity to escape from work pressures and daily life. I packed everything I needed: a tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and of course, my mobile phone to take pictures and send updates to my family. I promised my little sister Sarah that I would send her daily video updates about my trip. On Monday morning, I set off with my 3 friends, Jake, Mike, and Tom. The trip was fun. We exchanged stories and jokes all the way. We arrived at the edge of the forest in the afternoon and started our journey on foot towards the campsite we had chosen. The view was stunning. Giant cedar trees surrounded us on all sides, and the fresh air filled our lungs. I felt relaxed and at peace as I walked amidst this enchanting nature. After 2 hours of walking, we reached the campsite. It was a beautiful spot next to a small stream. We set up our tents and lit a fire to cook dinner. We sat around the fire, exchanging stories and laughing until late at night. Before going to sleep, I sent a short video to my sister Sarah, telling her about our first day and how wonderful it was. I promised her more updates in the coming days. I woke up on Tuesday morning to the sound of birds and the gurgling of water. It was another beautiful day. We spent the day exploring the area surrounding the campsite. We found a small waterfall and swam in the cold pool beneath it. In the evening, I sent another update to Sarah. But I noticed that the phone signal was very weak. I told myself I would try to send more updates tomorrow when we moved to another area. Wednesday was different. We woke up to the sound of thunder. The sky was overcast with dark clouds. We decided to stay at the camp instead of exploring. I tried to send a message to Sarah, but there was no signal at all. It started raining heavily in the afternoon. We had to stay inside the tents. The atmosphere was gloomy and tense. I felt worried about not being able to communicate with my family, but I tried to reassure myself that everything would be okay. But things were not okay. In the middle of the night, we woke up to a terrifying scream. It was Jake's voice. We got out of our tents to find him, but he had disappeared. We searched everywhere around the camp, but found no trace of him. We spent the rest of the night in a state of fear and anxiety. We couldn't sleep. We kept hearing strange sounds coming from the forest, sounds we hadn't heard before. Heavy footsteps, deep breaths, and sometimes what sounded like a faint roar. As the sun rose, we decided to leave the camp and return to the city. We were scared and confused. We started packing our things quickly, but suddenly we heard another scream. This time it was Mike's scream. We ran towards the source of the sound, but all we found were strange footprints on the muddy ground. They were very large, bigger than anything we had seen before, and there was a trace of a heavy body being dragged on the ground. Now only Tom and I were left. We were terrified. We tried to call the police, but there was no signal. We decided to try to reach the edge of the forest as quickly as possible. We started walking, trying to follow the path we came from. But the forest looked different now. The trees seemed denser, the shadows deeper. We felt as if the forest itself was trying to prevent us from leaving. After hours of walking, we realized we had lost our way. We were in a part of the forest we hadn't seen before. The trees here were gigantic, and there was a thick fog covering the ground. Suddenly, we heard a sound from afar. It sounded like a human voice calling. We thought it might be Jake or Mike. We ran towards the source of the sound, ignoring the fear that filled our hearts. But what we found wasn't what we expected. We reached the edge of a rocky cliff, and at the bottom we saw something we couldn't believe. There was a huge creature, standing on two legs like a human, but much taller and larger. Its body was covered with thick fur, and its head resembled that of a deer, but with larger and more complex antlers. The creature was standing next to a large cave, and on the ground in front of it, we saw bodies. Human bodies. I felt sick as I realized these bodies might be our missing friends. Before we could move, the creature turned towards us. Its large yellow eyes met mine, and I felt terror freeze the blood in my veins. It let out a terrifying roar and started climbing the cliff towards us. Tom screamed, "Run!" and we started running as fast as we could. We ran through the forest, branches scratching our faces and arms. We could hear the creature behind us getting closer and closer. Suddenly, Tom stumbled and fell. I turned to help him, but he shouted at me to keep running. That was the last thing I heard from him. I continued running, tears filling my eyes, and Tom's screams filling my ears. I don't know how long I ran. All I know is that I finally found myself at the edge of the forest. I saw the road and my car in the distance. I ran towards it, my heart pounding heavily. I reached the car and jumped inside. I started the engine and drove off at full speed. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a huge shadow standing at the edge of the forest, watching me as I drove away. Now, as I sit in the police station, trying to explain what happened, they don't believe me. They say it might have been a bear, or that I was hallucinating due to stress and fear. But I know what I saw. I know there's something in that forest, something that can't be explained. I don't know what I'll do now. How will I tell my friends' families what happened? How will I live with these memories? All I know is that I will never return to that forest again, and I hope that creature stays there, away from our world. But deep in my heart, I fear it might not stay there. I fear it might come out someday, and then I don't know what will happen to our world. Days passed since my return from the forest, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that terrifying creature and the faces of my missing friends. The police started a search in the forest, but they found no trace of my friends or the creature I described. One night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard a strange sound outside my window. It sounded like the heavy footsteps I had heard in the forest. I jumped out of my bed, my heart pounding. I looked out the window, but saw nothing but darkness. The next day, I decided to go to the local library to search for any information about strange creatures in the area. I spent hours flipping through old books and local legends. I found some stories about a creature called Wendigo, a mythical being from Native American folklore. The description was similar to what I had seen, but I wasn't sure. While I was deep in reading, I noticed an old man watching me. He approached and asked what I was looking for. When I told him, he looked concerned. He said, "Son, some secrets should remain buried, but if you're determined to know more, there's someone you should meet." The old man gave me an address for a cabin on the outskirts of town. He said the cabin's owner was called Uncle Joe, and he was a Native American who knew a lot about the area's history and secrets. The next day, I went to the cabin. It was a simple place, surrounded by trees. I knocked on the door, and after a moment, an old man with a wrinkled face and a sharp gaze opened it. "You're the young man who saw the Wendigo, aren't you?" he asked me directly. I was surprised that he knew the reason for my visit. Uncle Joe invited me in and began to tell an old story. Hundreds of years ago, this land was sacred to our people, but strangers came and cut down the trees and built their cities. Nature became angry, and the ancient spirits awakened. The Wendigo is the embodiment of this anger. He told me that the Wendigo appears every few decades, takes some victims, then disappears again. "But this time is different," Uncle Joe said with concern. "It's getting closer to the town. The forest is shrinking and the Wendigo feels threatened. It's looking for a new place." I asked him what I could do. He looked at me with sad eyes and said, "Son, you're now part of this. The Wendigo saw you and let you live. This means it chose you for a reason." I felt terror coursing through my body. "What does that mean?" I asked with a trembling voice. "It means you're the only one who can stop it. You must return to the forest. You must find the cave you saw and destroy it. That's where the Wendigo draws its power from." I left Uncle Joe's cabin feeling confused and scared. How could I return to that terrible place? How could I face that creature again? That night, I woke up to the sound of screaming. It was coming from the street. I looked out the window and saw my neighbor running down the street, screaming that a monster had attacked his son. I felt panic fill me. The Wendigo had started attacking the town. I realized I had no other choice. I had to go back to the forest. I had to stop this nightmare. The next morning, I packed some equipment, a flashlight, rope, knife, and some food and water. Before I left, I remembered something Uncle Joe had said. I went to the local herb shop and bought some herbs he said might help protect me. I reached the edge of the forest at noon. I stood there for a while, trying to gather my courage. Then, slowly, I began to enter between the trees. The forest was unnaturally quiet. I couldn't hear any birds or animals. The air was heavy and humid. I walked for hours, trying to remember the way to the cave. As the sun set, I began to feel desperate. I was lost and didn't know where I was going. Suddenly, I heard a voice from afar. It sounded like Jake, my missing friend. "Jake?" I called out. There was no response, but I heard the voice again, this time closer. I started running towards the source of the sound, ignoring my mind's warning that this could be a trap. I reached an open area in the forest, and there, in the middle of the clearing, I saw it. The Wendigo was standing there, tall and terrifying as I remembered it. But this time, it was looking directly at me, as if it had been waiting for me. I felt paralyzed with fear. I wanted to run, but my feet refused to move. The Wendigo started approaching me slowly. Each step shook the ground. Suddenly, I remembered the herbs I had bought. With a trembling hand, I took them out of my bag and threw them towards the creature. Something strange happened. The Wendigo started to retreat, as if the smoke rising from the herbs was hurting it. I took this opportunity and ran. I ran like I had never run before. I heard the Wendigo roar behind me, but I didn't stop. After what seemed like hours, I reached a rocky slope. And there, I saw the entrance to the cave. I quickly entered the cave, my heart pounding hard. The place was dark and damp. I turned on my flashlight and looked around. The cave walls were covered with strange drawings and ancient marks. Deep in the cave, I found a large room, and in its center, there was a large stone inscribed with strange symbols. I felt a strange energy emanating from the stone. Suddenly, I heard the Wendigo's voice approaching. I had no time to think. I took out the knife and started carving into the symbols on the stone, trying to destroy them. With each symbol I destroyed, I felt the cave shake. I heard the Wendigo's scream getting closer and closer. I continued carving with all my strength. Finally, with the last symbol I destroyed, there was an explosion of light. I felt a wave of energy rush through the cave. I heard the Wendigo scream, but it was different this time. It was a scream of pain and defeat. Suddenly silence prevailed. I slowly left the cave, afraid of what I might see. But the forest was quiet. There was no trace of the Wendigo. I returned to town, exhausted and confused. I wasn't sure exactly what had happened, or if the Wendigo had really disappeared. In the following weeks, there were no more attacks. Life slowly began to return to normal. But I didn't forget what happened. Every night, I dreamed of the forest, the cave, and the Wendigo. And on some nights, when I look out my window towards the distant forest, I wonder, is it really over? Or is the Wendigo still out there, waiting, watching, ready to return someday? I don't know the answer. All I know is that I will never forget what happened in that forest. and that I will always be ready in case the Wendigo returns someday. Months passed, and life in our small town seemed to return to normal. The disappearances of Jake, Mike, and Tom were still unsolved mysteries, but people had started to move on. I, however, couldn't shake off the memories of what I'd seen in the forest. One day, I received a call from an unknown number. When I answered, I heard a familiar voice. It was Uncle Joe. "You need to come to the cabin," he said urgently. "There's something you must know." I drove to Uncle Joe's cabin that evening, my mind racing with possibilities. When I arrived, I found him sitting on his porch, looking more worried than ever. "It's not over," he said as soon as I approached. "The Wendigo, it's evolving." Uncle Joe explained that he had been having visions, terrible nightmares of the Wendigo changing, growing stronger. "The ritual you performed in the cave," he said, "it didn't destroy the Wendigo, it forced it to adapt." He told me that the Wendigo was now able to take on human form. It could walk among us, undetected. "But it still needs to feed," Uncle Joe warned, "and it's hungry." As if to confirm his words, we heard a news report on the radio inside the cabin. There had been a gruesome murder in town, a body found mutilated in a way that the police couldn't explain. "It's starting again," I whispered, feeling a chill run down my spine. Uncle Joe nodded gravely. "You're connected to it now," he said. "You're the only one who can sense its presence. You need to find it and stop it before it's too late." I left Uncle Joe's cabin with a heavy heart and a terrible responsibility. How was I supposed to find a creature that could look like anyone? Over the next few weeks, more mysterious deaths occurred in town. Each time, I felt a strange sensation, a sort of tingling at the base of my skull. I realized this must be what Uncle Joe meant about sensing the Wendigo's presence. I started investigating each incident, following my instincts. I noticed patterns. The attacks always happened on nights with no moon and always near wooded areas. One night, while I was staking out a park at the edge of town, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving with an unnatural grace. At first glance, it looked human, but as it passed under a streetlight, I saw its eyes gleam with an eerie yellow light. I followed the figure, my heart pounding. It led me to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. As I watched, the figure's shape began to change, stretching and contorting until it once again resembled the monstrous Wendigo I had seen in the forest. I knew I had to act, but I felt woefully unprepared. Then I remembered the herbs that had helped me before. I had brought some with me just in case. I took them out, set them alight, and threw them into the warehouse. The effect was immediate. I heard an inhuman shriek of pain from inside. The Wendigo burst out of the warehouse, its human disguise gone, revealing its true, terrifying form. It saw me and roared in fury. I turned and ran, leading it away from the town and back toward the forest. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I found myself back at the cave where this had all started. I dove inside, the Wendigo close behind. In the heart of the cave, I saw the stone with the symbols I had destroyed months ago. But now, new symbols were forming, glowing with an otherworldly light. I realized what I had to do. As the Wendigo entered the cave, I began to carve new symbols into the stone. Symbols of protection that Uncle Joe had taught me. The Wendigo howled and charged at me, but with each symbol I completed, it seemed to grow weaker. Finally, as I finished the last symbol, there was a blinding flash of light. When my vision cleared, the Wendigo was gone. In its place was a swirling vortex of energy. Somehow, I knew that this was a portal to the spirit world, where the Wendigo truly belonged. Without thinking, I reached out and touched the vortex. Immediately I was overwhelmed with visions. I saw the history of the land, the anger of nature, the pain that had created the Wendigo. And I understood. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of the cave. The vortex was gone, and with it, the Wendigo. But I could feel that something had changed within me. I returned to town a different person. The killing stopped, and slowly life truly did return to normal. But I knew that my role as protector had just begun. Now as I stand at the edge of the forest, I can feel the balance between our world and the spirit world. And I know that if that balance is ever threatened again, I'll be ready. The Wendigo taught me that there are forces in this world beyond our understanding. But it also taught me that with knowledge, courage, and compassion, even the most terrifying monsters can be overcome. As I turn back towards the town, I smile. The forest behind me whispers with secrets. But for now at least, those secrets are at peace. And so am I.